Now I'm not just hearing somebody else's story or reading about it. We're caught up in the middle of it. And we're living it real time. And it's getting very interesting that the God of this, if this is God, this God that's flung the stars of heaven into the universe, that commanded the waters of the sea to recede and the mountains to come up, is directly communicating with us on his will for these people and our part in it, and we're being invited. Blew my mind.
Last week in episode 81, Joe Pritchard described how God brought him into faith and an eventual call to preach. But that was just the groundwork for what came next. Today, we continue our conversation with Joe Pritchard as he shares the remarkable account of how God called him into planting a growing church, into global missions, and the amazing adventure he was led through as he obeyed God's calling. He also shares how he experienced a 2-year agonizing spiritual desert before God showed him the way out and back into the love and compassion that had guided him before. Once again, Joe Pritchard. And I think sometimes we think if we do turn to God, what are people going to think about me? Is life's not going to be fun anymore? I don't get to do all these fun. It's just not what happens.
Yeah, and we have friends too that walked away that never came back.
Yeah, and it happened.
It just scared them
all
to
the time.
death. They were like, nah, And so we just prayed for them and hoped that things would change, and hopefully that they would see in our lives that we didn't give up anything. We gained everything.
Yeah, but when God calls them and they are turned, they're going to turn and they're going to see with new eyes, and they're probably going to run towards you guys and say, "Oh my gosh, this is amazing." All right, so I know we got it. That is so cool, and that is an important conversation, because I feel like there's just a ton of folks walking in and out of churches every Sunday, who do not have a relationship with the very God that founded that church, that's the head of that church, and it's right in front of them, and he's begging them, and they're missing the most amazing thing they could imagine. So anyway. So what happened?
Well, after that, I started thinking that there's got to be more to this than there's something I'm missing here. And because I would pick up a book and read about David Livingstone, trampling through Africa, and they cut his heart out and buried it in Africa and toted his body to the ship. That's how much of an impact he had on these people. And I thought, what would make people do that? I didn't really understand what walking by faith meant. And then bad things, people think just because you get saved, everything's going to get really good. And what happens is you get put on the potter's wheel, and that wheel starts to turn. And it started to turn in our life, and we experienced, physical issues with my wife's health. We experienced financial issues. We experienced just all things that seemed like we were going like, what's going on here? We're trying to serve the Lord, and things happened that pushed us out of the only church we'd ever known, and we were just disoriented. We were like, why is this happening? And it was hurtful, and we went for like a year just in no man's land. And we would visit this church, and we would visit that church, and we would visit this church, and it was just like, none of these are where we're supposed to be. And so I came in one afternoon, and my kids are still pretty young, they're in their, early teens, maybe late middle school age probably. And we'd been at, that church for a long time. And I came in, we're gone now. I came in one day, and my phone rang, and it was this gentleman that, I know who he is. They're friends with my mom, and they used to come hear me preach every now and then. We're not just like well acquainted with one another, but I know who they are.
Yeah.
And he says, "Hey, Joe, this is so-and-so." And I said, "Hey, how you doing?" He said, "I'm doing fine." He said, "Listen, so I came in today from work. My wife's sitting on the couch crying, and it's about you." That was his exact words.
I was like, what?
And I said, well, in my mind, I'm
like, I didn't do anything.
I have said something somewhere that just got in their crawl space. And I said, well, if I've done anything wrong, I'm not sure what it is. I'll apologize for it. He said, "Oh, no, you misunderstood the comment." he said she was just praying today, and she really has this overwhelming sense that God wants us to do something for you. And I said, okay. I never had anything like it happen to me before. And he said, let me throw something by you. He said, we're going to go to Israel for 10 days. And he said, we'd like for you to go. And he says, that's something you'd be willing to do. And I said, well, I'd love to go to Israel and see what I preached on. But I said, I got 2 little kids, and, and my wife can't work anymore. And I said, financially, I don't see that happening. He said, no, you misunderstood what I said. He said, let me just put it out there plainly for you. He said, we're willing to pay your way to Israel for 10 days, all expenses, plane ticket, hotel, food. All you have to do is say yes if you think that this is something that you're supposed to do, because this is what God's laid on our heart. And I said, let's go. And so we loaded up on a plane. I was so ignorant about it, I didn't even know I was with a church group. That's how dumb I was. I just thought me and these couples going to Israel, So I get on a plane, and
for the record, if anybody is called to send me to Israel for like that, I am for it, man. That sounds like a dream come true. But anyway, so go ahead.
And they said, we want your mom to go too. Well, my mom's never been out of Dallas, Georgia, right? And it was That's a whole nother story.
Want your mom to come too?
Huh?
Want your mom to come too?
Yeah, they wanted her to come too because that was their friend.
Okay,
so
that's right.
So we get on a plane. She's never been on a plane out of the United States.
Yeah.
It was hilarious. Let's just say that. But anyway, we get over there, and I still don't know why I'm there, who I'm there with. And this lady comes up and says, hey, are you part of the group? And I said, what group? She said, well, this is a church group you're with. And I'm like, well, okay.
Sure.
And I said, well, who's leading the group? She said, Dr. Mark Rutland. And I said, who's that? She's like, you don't know Mark Rutland? I said, if he come up and shook my hand right now, I have no idea who he is. She said, are you serious? I said, ma'am, I'm just here. That's all I can tell you. Somebody paid my way to come. I'm here. And she said, well, that guy over there is Mark Rutland. I said, okay. Good. Nice, nice that I know who he is now. And so, it was a big group. And we went to visit the sites that first day, and then in the afternoons we would come back, and bless their heart, they put us up in the King David Motel. And the King David Motel's back deck sits on the shore of Galilee. Literally. The water slaps against the back deck of Galilee.
Wow.
And so I went out there that first night, and I sat down by Galilee, and the full moon was up, and I could see a boat going across the distance, and you could hear the little drums playing. And I was like, God, why'd you bring me here? I know you didn't bring me here just to bring me here. Why did you bring me here? And I just sat there, and I would just be silent. And the next day we'd get up and we would go and we'd visit other sites, and it was amazing what the things that visually came to life that were, when we would see the Valley of Armageddon or something like that. And at night, though, he started gathering the people together and started talking about his journey of faith. And I was absolutely floored at the stories this man was telling. I had never heard anything like that. I couldn't imagine how that unfolded. And there's one thing I knew, and I don't have time to cover the stories that were told. You can find them online if you look up Dr. Mark Rutland, about things that God had placed in his heart that took a lot of faith to move in a direction that he didn't know where exactly it was going to lead him to and what exactly was going to happen when he got there. And it was major moves. And the things that he talked about when he finally put his feet to his faith were resonating with me like thunder in my ears. I mean, it was like, this is why you're here. I'm glad you got to come see, these places, but the reason you're here is to hear that. And I would go back at night and I thought, I have never heard anything like that in my entire life. I don't understand. Even though I read Abraham, get thee out of thy country and away from thy kinsmen to a place that I'll show you, I didn't really connect that personally. and what the results of that could be if you actually believed and would move by faith. And so every night he would go through something like that, and I got to meet him a couple of times, no more than a handshake. He wouldn't know me if he'd seen me today, but that trip had a major impact on my life. And I was sitting there without a church, without anywhere for my family to go to church, and I said, Lord, if I started a church, what would we call it? And I just took a piece of paper out and I wrote down New Covenant Fellowship Church. And I said, and I just was sat on the shore of Galilee and think about it. And then when we got back home, I had another family that was kind of in the same place we were. Two of them, actually, two families. Between us all, probably 10 people. And I said, you know what? I said, my aunt's got a little block building over here that they do singings in, but it has a little kitchen in it, and it's pretty small. I said, I'm going to go over and ask her if we can just have church one Sunday. So I rode over there and I said, listen, would you mind if we had church in your little block building in a couple of Sundays? She said, absolutely. Come on. That's what this is for God's use. So I called the two families. I said, they said we could have church over there instead of looking everywhere. Let's just go have church Sunday over there together. Well, what we thought Tim was going to show up turned out to be about 35 or so. Mm. It was just full. And I'm like, okay, you know what we do now? And we just kept having church, and it kept growing. And then we went on vacation in Florida, and this guy calls me up on the phone. He says, hey, you interested in the church building? I said, who are you? And he said, well, your uncle's been having church down here in this building. It's a trailer that they turned into a church. He said, it's got a baptismal and all that kind of stuff. He said, if you're interested in it, I'd like to show it to you. I said, okay, who are you again, and what's your number, Mm-hmm. And when we got back from Florida, I rode over and looked at it, and we wound up moving our little congregation to that trailer church, and it kept growing. And it was during that time period that a church in the county, a large church in the county, had a work going on in West Africa, in Burkina Faso. And they called me and they said, hey, we'd like for you to go to West Africa to see a work that's going on here. What do you think about that? And I said, well, I'll get back with you, And I told my wife, I said, you're talking about a $2,000 plane ticket here. We don't have $2,000. And so I bumped into this gentleman at a store who owned I'll just say a place of business in our community.
Okay.
And he said, hey, I heard you was invited to go on this trip with these pastors to West Africa. And I said, yes, sir, I was. He said, are you going to go? And I said, well, I don't know. He said, well, why don't you know about it? I said, well, if God wants me to go, I'll go. I said, that's kind of an expensive trip. And I said, I'm not really in that kind of place to spend that kind of money. He said, you need to go home and pray about that. And the trip was really close. I said, okay. So a week later, my phone rings. It's him again. He said, did you pray about that? I said, I sure did. He said, what's your answer? I said, well, here's what I'm going to tell you. I said, God says to go and start right here in my community. Go to Samaria, Jerusalem, Samaria, go to the ends of the earth. And if he wants me to go to the ends of the earth to preach the gospel, I'll go. That's all I can tell you. He said, good, pack your bags. I paid your way. Wrote a check. And so,
that's the second time.
Second time. So I get on a plane, go to West Africa. We go in the bush and meet a tribe called the Pugali that they had been working with. They had drilled a well. Part of their mission there is to drill wells. And then that's one of the ways they reach out to the other tribes in the bush. They come and say, how did you get water? And they say, God gave us water. And he moves his message that way through those wells. And when we got over there, I met a missionary who was with us named John Arnold. And that's the kind of guy I'd mentioned to you before we started the podcast. And he had been a missionary there for quite a while. And he and I bonded pretty quick. And I kind of thought, part of me being here is to meet him. And he began to share stories with me about how God moved the gospel through those villages that I just never heard anything like that. And if you were to share it with some people, they'd walk off and go, that can't be real.
Like what?
Well, it's like an example he gave was they would set up a two-sided screen in the village. If they could get access into a village, which was hard to do. Normally, you had to do it by medicine. Mm-hmm. Because every village has a witch doctor. They have a tribal chief and a witch doctor.
Yeah.
But they would be open. There was 2 older ladies there that were missionaries, and their whole mission was to go with medicine, and they would get entrance into the village. And so they taught this one chief into allowing them to come into this village. They would set up a 2-sided screen, and they would show the gospel film, the Jesus film, in their language. Well, in the bush, if you turn on the light in the dark, you can see it for a long. It looks like Texas. It looks like the brush country in Texas. And so during one of those episodes, a guy from another village saw the light and walked toward the light. He sat in on the preaching, and he told me that during the preaching there was a ruckus going on, and he noticed, this is a missionary telling me, that they had killed a snake. And the snake was moving towards the pastor when they killed it that was preaching the gospel in their language. And they hung the snake up, and they were cutting it open, and the missionary walked over there, and he said, "What are you doing?" He said, "White man, you wouldn't understand." And he said, "This snake was sent to kill the pastor." And he said with him visually looking at it, they cut the snake open, and there was no entrails in the snake at all. He said the snake was made by the witch doctors, and it was sent to kill the pastor.
The snake was, so it was an actual snake?
It was an actual snake.
With no insides?
With no insides. And I was just like, I was like, I didn't know what to say. What could I say? And I had no reason to doubt this man. This man's on the ground here for 14, 15 years. And, he's seen things that just because I don't understand it don't mean I can't just turn around and discount it because I live here in the United States.
Yeah.
And what happened that night, though, was one of those men heard the gospel and went back to his village, and he had expressed to the people there that he believed the story about this God that was told to him that night. And he goes back to his village, and John said when he got there, he began trying to tell other people about this God. The witch doctor got it in for him, and the tribal chief. And so what they wanted to do is they gave him the worst piece of ground in the village to grow, because if you don't grow food in the bush, you die. Simple as that. It's the second poorest region on earth, Burkina Faso. And so they gave him the worst piece of ground that nobody could ever grow crops on, so that they could make an example out of him to all the other villagers that this is what happens when you follow the wrong God. And he said when the crops came in that year, only one person had crops.
And it was him.
It was him. And so the villagers go to him and say, "Why does your crops grow and ours doesn't?" And he would say, "Because the God that I now know gave me the crops." And that's how the gospel moves over there.
Wow.
That's
incredible.
It is incredible. And for us, we go, but I don't tell God how he moves the gospel. That's just here's what a man told me that's been on the ground with these people for years and things that he had seen. And I was just floored by it. And when I came home, I was trying to tell people, and I invited him to come speak at our church because he was not far down the road from where we were. He was home from the church that was supporting him, the one that took us over there. And, I don't know what people thought about that. I don't. But he told them, he just tells them exactly what he's seen happen over there. And that sort of got me on the journey of there's a lot more to this than what I think. And
there's more, right? There's more. I think that's a truth about Christianity that we don't embrace. I think we like to settle in. We tend to settle in.
Yeah, we like to be comfortable.
That's right.
Yeah, we like to plug in and plug out.
That's right.
You go over and plug in Sunday, you plug back out Sunday evening. And I just wasn't happy with being comfortable. I just thought there's got to be more. God's showing me that there's more to this.
Yeah.
But I'm not personally involved in this. Mm-hmm. It's not happened to me. So our congregations kept growing, and we decided early on that we were going to be missional in our community. Anywhere that we thought that God was making himself known to us as a body, that he was inviting us to come and be a part of that work, we would do it. And people bought into that. And we saw God start to do things amongst us, and during that time, we had a gentleman that had a lawn care business, and he was over somewhere close to our county near the interstate. And there was 2 Hispanic young males there, probably in their early 30s, came over to him, and they couldn't speak Spanish. He couldn't speak English. He couldn't speak Spanish. They were in bad shape. Their clothes were, they were just obviously in bad shape, but they couldn't express what they're trying to say. Somebody happened to be there that day that could speak enough Spanish to determine what was going on. And basically, this has been years ago, and that's probably about 2010. They had paid human traffickers to bring them across the border. They were going to Florida to try to find work. Their families' lives depend on the work because they borrowed money that has to be paid back from the wrong people.
Right.
You don't pay it back, bad things happen.
Yeah.
And their explanation was, we've been in this cattle truck for a long time, and they pulled over at this exit. We don't know where we are, and they've dropped us out. And they took the girl that was with us with them, and we don't know what's happened to her. They put them out at gunpoint. So the gentleman calls me and says, what do we do? I'm like, I don't know. I said, well, bring them to the church. So he puts them in his truck, brings them to the church. We had a little block building. It had a little bathroom in it and a sink in it. And he says, what do we do now? I said, I don't know. I said, maybe we'll just try to reach out to Hispanic ministry here and see if they can help us. Man, I ran into dead end after dead end on that. It's like, I'm not giving you criminals here. I just don't know what to do here.
Yeah.
So I went to Lifeway, and I asked the lady, I said, you got anything in here that's got English on one side, Spanish on the other, that's got the gospel in it? She said, yeah, right here it is. I said, give it to me. So I went back to the building, and I did the best I could to say in Spanish the gospel to those 2 boys. And every time I would preach on Sundays, I would put my message up in English, and then I found a Google translator that would translate it. Who knows what it really said? But
I've done it. I think they're pretty good.
Yeah, I put it out there.
Yeah.
I put it up for them.
Yeah.
One of the boys wound up leaving with a crew that we didn't know he was going to leave. He just sort of left, didn't tell us. The other one's name was Javier. Javier stuck around, and one Sunday during the service, I looked down on the front row, and Javier was squalling. And Javier had told us through an interpreter that he now believed in the God that we believed in, and that he was not a nice human being to his wife in Mexico in his prior life. And he has had contact with her, trying to explain to her that his life's changed and she don't believe him. So this one day we had an interpreter that just visited our church. We didn't know he spoke Spanish. Somehow another conversation came up. I said, can you meet me back here in the back room and see what's wrong with Javier? I mean, he's still crying. And so we meet in the back room, and he says, in Spanish, Javier, tell us what's going on. And he said, I've talked to my wife, and she believes that I really have changed. And he said, and she has a message for the pastor here. And I said, well, what's the message? She said, will you come tell our family about the God that my husband knows now?
Wow.
And so, me and one of my buddies that had kind of walked away from me, who's now an elder with me.
Yeah.
We're looking at one another going, that's got to be God. But what do we, and so we find out he lives in Irapuato, Mexico. It's about an hour and a half from Mexico City. And we was like, what do we do next? And I've never been out of the country other than to go to Israel and West Africa. We don't have anybody in church that's fluent in Spanish. And we just happened at a meeting we were in, met a guy in Marietta, Georgia, fluent in Spanish. That was his background. And we said, hey, you wouldn't be interested in going to Irapuato with us? We'll pay you way if you'll go. Something happened work-wise where I could not go on that first meeting. I was so disappointed. And before the trip, we started trying to arrange the trip. Javier was arranging for his family to know that we were coming. And one night I went to sleep. And I'll just preface this by saying I have never had a dream before, never had a dream since like I dreamed that night. And I can't tell you that God won't ever do that again. And I can't tell you that he ever will do it again. But I went to sleep that night. And obviously when you talk about things in a conversation, sometimes you go home and dream about them, right?
Right.
That's the human part of us that
That's
writes
right.
that off.
Mm-hmm.
So in the dream, knowing that we're getting ready to go, we're going to send 2 people to Irapuato, I dreamed that I was preaching in Mexico. And that I was standing outside the church, and there was a fence gate, and people were coming by the bunches, hundreds, across the road and into this big giant block building. And I even knew where I was preaching. In my dream, it was a place called Chiapas, Mexico. Chiapas.
How did you know that?
I just knew it. I don't know. I mean, it was just in the dream. I got up the next day and I called my buddy and I said, meet me at the church. I met him up there. I said, you ain't going to believe what I dreamed last night. I said, dude, and I went through the whole thing with him. This is what I dreamed. I said, what's so funny about it is I knew where I was. I said, I was in a place called Chiapas, Mexico, but there is no place in Mexico called Chiapas. I said, so it must just been I had too many onions on my chili dog yesterday. And we laughed about it. But it was real to me. It was real, but, we just kind of laughed, and we sent them off to Irapuato. And during that time, his extended family was over 100 people in that town. And they would come and crowd into the house and stay in the street that night. And they preached the gospel to them for a week. And there was 25 people that said that they had given their life to Christ. On the last night of that trip, before they come home, an older woman, a very older woman, came up with her hand out to one of the guys that we had sent with them. And she was trying to tell them something. And they found somebody that could speak English. And he said, you can tell the man what your question is. And she said, would you promise me that you will come back to Mexico and tell my people about the God that they've met here tonight? And he's like, okay, where's it at? And she said, it's in Chiapas, Chiappas, Mexico. Not Chiapas, Chiapas. And he's like, where's that at? She said, it's at the southern tip of Mexico. So he flies back home. He says, you ain't going to believe what got asked of me. I said, what? He said, this old lady come up to me. He said, you remember the dream you had? He said, it's not Chiapas, Mexico. We've been asked to come to Chiapas, Mexico. I said, you kidding me? He said, I am not joking. And I thought, that's got to be God.
Or else it's one of the greatest coincidences of Georgia history.
Yeah. So now I'm not just hearing somebody else's story or reading about it. We're caught up in the middle of it. And we're living it real time. And it's getting very interesting that the God of this, if this is God, this God that's flung the stars of heaven into the universe, that commanded the waters of the sea to recede and the mountains to come up, is directly communicating with us on his will for these people and our part in it. And we're being invited. Blew my mind. Just blew my mind. And so now I'm thinking, okay, what do we do next? And so some time went by because that guy that moved on that we were using for an interpreter moved off, and we couldn't find anybody else who spoke the language. Time kept going by. And then finally one day, there's a mission group in Georgia called Operation Mobilization. They operate ships that go around and port, and they also have missionaries all over the world. I got introduced to them through a friend, and they had came to my church a few times when I was pastoring the church. And he calls me on the phone. He says, hey, just out of the blue, he says, hey, I got the head of our Mexican missions here today in the United States. Would you like to meet him? Because I had shared with him about the story that I just told you. He said, we won't have a lot of time, but we got enough time for lunch. I said, absolutely, let's go meet him. So me and a friend drive down, and we meet him at a restaurant, him and his wife. Sweet man, sweet woman. And he says, tell the man about your dream. And so I start from beginning to where we've talked about now. And he's just sitting over on the side of the table, and him and his wife just boo-hooing. They ain't said a word. They're just crying. And I'm like, this is weird. I don't know what's going on here.
Just told him a dream.
Yeah, I just told you my dream. And it was an emotional for them. And finally he says, and he could speak English. He said, Joe, I need to tell you something. He said, we're about to have a outreach to Mexico, to an area that we believe is probably one of the most unreached areas of Mexico. And we're going to do it over Easter week. He said, if I invited you to come, would you come? I said, yeah, I'll go. I said, where's it at? Chiapas, Mexico. I'm just sitting there shaking my head. I said, you got to be kidding me. He said, no. He said, this is an area in the mountains back here that we believe is an indigenous people that need to hear the gospel as bad as anybody anywhere in Mexico. And he said, I'll get everything arranged for you to come. So you stop me whenever you want to stop me. I'll just continue. So I go back home. I tell my wife, I said, I got invited to go to Chiapas, Mexico over Easter week. Bless her heart. She's so faithful to support me, even when she don't understand. She said, are you going? I said, well, I told him I'd go. She said, all right. And I started praying about it, and I thought, well, just in my mind, I kept thinking, one of my buddies, my childhood buddies that's now a believer, kept coming to my mind. You need to ask him to come with you. So I called him on the phone. I said, hey, buddy. I said, remember all the stuff I've been telling you about Mexico? And he said, yeah. I said, it's true, man. I said, something's going on. God's got something going on, but I think he wants you to be a part of it. He's never been on a mission trip. He's like, let me pray about it. And he's explained it to his mother and his children. They're kind of tripping out over it a little bit. I mean, there's areas of Mexico that, like anywhere else in the world, can be dangerous. We don't know anything about the place. This is how Satan works. The next week in school, he's trying to make his decision. His daughter goes to school, and they're having career day. Here's my uncle. He works for Delta. He's a pilot. He gets up, tells about his career, and then somebody brought their aunt or somebody in, and she worked for a magazine called Voice of the Martyr magazine. It's been around for years, and they talk about Christianity and the spread of the gospel into some of the most dangerous areas of the world. And she's talking about that, and she turns the cover around, and her daughter notices that it's Mexico, and she's explaining about the magazine, and she points that here's a for instance case. Here's Mexico, and this little red star down here is the place that we've identified as one of the most dangerous areas in Mexico to preach the gospel. And
it's Chiapas, Mexico.
Yeah, it's Chiapas. Because so now she's tripping out, But they prayed through it, and he agreed to go. And I told my wife, I said, look, this is what happened. Evidently, this is not a nice place, but it's where God's calling us to. And so we got on a plane, flew to Mexico City, transferred to Chiapas. When we hit the ground in Chiapas, all I could hear was people screaming at us. It was military people. It's a very small airport. We couldn't speak English or Spanish. They couldn't speak English. We didn't know what they were trying to tell us. And they're just screaming. And so we're just like, we got to get out of this airport before something bad happens, and we're trying to open our bags up. We don't know what they're telling us to do. They're getting frustrated with us. And finally, this woman comes. We're headed toward a side door. It looks like it goes outside, and this woman steps in and goes, "Are you Joe?" And I said, "I am." She said, "I'm here to pick you up." I said, "Thank God." She picks us up, puts us in the car. I said, "Who are you?" I'm expecting the gentleman that I met. He's supposed to meet us down there. She said, "Oh, he won't be here till Wednesday." This is like Sunday. I'm like, well, I said, okay. So we get in the car with her. We're driving down the road. And she said, "I'm so glad y'all are here." And she said, "I teach English in a Spanish college here." And she said, I have been praying so diligently that God would send somebody here. She said, I've been trying to witness to specifically 4 of my students. And I've just been praying for them and praying for them that God will send somebody here that can get through to them with the gospel. And I wanted to say, well, ma'am, I'd like to help you, but we're going in the mountains tomorrow, probably. All of our bags are packed to go in the mountains. We got boots and things to go up in the mountains. And she drives us into this town called Chiapas. And she says, you're going to go eat with this family tonight, and you're going to be staying. A lady's going to come here. You're going to spend the night in their home tonight. Okay. She said, and you're going to preach right there tomorrow in that church, right down the street. I said, well, I thought we were going to the mountains. She said, well, tomorrow you're going to preach right there. I said, okay. And, my buddy, we're looking at one another going, all right. So we go in with this family. Nobody can speak, English. We can't speak Spanish. And they're kind of giggling. We're giggling. I mean, it was a good fellowship, even though we didn't know what to say or what to do. We were just sitting there looking at one another, having dinner. This lady pulls up. She can speak English. She said, I'm Sally. You're going to come stay with our family tonight. Well, thank you, Sally. And we go spend the night with her that night and her family. They're very gracious. And she had 3 boys. And we would joke. We like to joke a lot. I'm a jokester to some degree, and my buddy is bad. And so we show up at the church the next day. And I wasn't prepared. I mean, this is a night's notice. I had been going through the book of Revelations at church, Revelation, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to present this piece of Revelation. And so when Sunday came, I was shocked at the number of people in that church. There's probably 200, a little over 200 people in it. And I preached this message, and we gave an invitation to come and surrender your life to Christ. And 4 people that I know got saved, and those were the 4 college kids that she'd been praying for who knows how long. Came and gave surrendered their life to Christ, and she was just overwhelmed. She was my translator that night, or that day, for the service, as to what I was preaching. And it hit me then that God will move heaven and earth to go get his own. And we just get to be a part of that if we'll go. And that whole trip never went. From that point forward, we never went where we thought we were going to go. We never did make it to the mountains. It was just like every day somebody was assigned to come pick us up, and they would take us to a church. And finally, toward the end of the week of just going here and there preaching, this lady pulls up, picks us up. She can't speak English. We can't speak Spanish. She starts driving. It's getting later in the afternoon. We don't know where she's taking us. We were just told she would pick us up. And it's getting toward dark, and we notice we passed a checkpoint where there's a station and guards, military people. And my buddy says, we're at a border. We're at a crossing, a nation. It looks like where 2 nations meet, because we knew we were way south. And we were right on the border of Guatemala and Mexico. There's a river that separates the two. It's a no man's land. All your drugs come across and filter up that way. And we went into this little town called Cacahuatan. I can't believe I could actually say it again. Called Cacahuatan.
That's good.
And we went into an open air church that night. And when I stepped in there, the Star of David banner was hanging up in the rafters. And they said, you're going to preach here tonight. I said, okay. And I preached. And this young boy came up, and he's trying to tell me something. I have no clue what he's trying to tell me afterwards. So finally somebody comes over and says, I'll interpret for him. And he keeps doing this like he's throwing a rock. And I'm like, buddy, I don't have any idea what, I'm trying to figure out what you're saying, but I don't know. He don't know what I'm saying. Person comes over. And the interpreter says he's trying to tell you that God has sent you 2 here to bring us the message that we need. And he said it's like taking, here's what he's trying to tell me. He said it's like throwing a rock in a pond. He said, you understand when you throw a rock in the pond? I said, yeah. He said, when it hits the water, the ripples go out. and he hit the bank. I said, yeah, I get it. He said, we're where the rock hit. And he said, from here, the gospel's going to go all over Mexico. And I was like, wow, okay. We didn't know what to say. He said what he had to say. And so me and my buddy just kind of pondered, like, this is crazy, all these things. But we're seeing God do things in real time. We're in the middle of it, real time. And we know that the things that are happening, we can't explain away. There's nothing we can say to explain this away because we're seeing it real time happening. And so we get to the last night, I get a phone call. I think the week's over. There's one more day in it, and I get a phone call, and we're in a hotel room, and the guy says, we're going to have a closing meeting tomorrow, and you've been assigned to preach the message for this whole week of ministry in Mexico, down in Chiapas in southern Mexico. And it's like 8 o'clock at night. And I'm thinking, in the morning? He said, yeah, in the morning. He said, we'll have this, somebody's going to meet you at the front door and pick you up and take you to where you're going to preach. I tell my buddy, I said, I don't, because I like to study, I like to get ready, I like to prepare. I'm like, dude, you got to pray for me. I said, it's hot in the hotel room. And he says, I'll lay over here and pray. I looked over, he's fast asleep. He's out.
It's like,
so here's the end of the story.
Guys in the garden.
Here's the end of the story. I get up next day, we get our clothes packed, put them in the car that picks us up, driving down the road, no idea where we're going, pulling this fence gate. And it was like deja vu. It's like you're rewinding a reel of that dream. And I started noticing, I looked at the building, and I hadn't said anything to my buddy. I'm like, in my mind, that's the building I saw. It's a big concrete building, and there's the fence. And I looked, and people were coming across the road.
Unbelievable.
In bunches, we're talking like 400 people. And they crowd in, and the lady that came and picked us up from Cacahuatan was there. The lady who was praying for the students were there. And the young people that we had traveled around with and ministered with during that week, they were there. I don't know who the other 300 or 400 or 500, however many people was there. And I thought, Lord, if you don't speak through me, I don't know I have no clue what's going to happen here. And we get up, they introduced me, and I just said, I had read that night, I said, we went and saw Mount Hermon where the dew comes down, and that's the head of the Jordan River. When I was in Israel, and I said, just as the dew hits Mount Hermon and the Jordan River comes out of the base and it provides the land everything it's needed, it's its primary source of life, and it comes from the top of that mountain. I said, Chiapas, Mexico is where the gospel is going to come from, and it's going to go all through Mexico, and you're going to spread life throughout Mexico from this point. Would you come and give your life? And if you haven't given your life to Christ, give it to Christ. And if you're willing to go and take the gospel, come. And there was just a flood of people that came down. What happened from that point forward, I don't know. And that's where it ended. And we came home. And me and my buddy were looking at one another going, is that not the craziest thing? And I said, if anybody else told me that, I'd probably be skeptical about it, but we lived it. And so whether they believe it or not, I can't help that. I saw God do what only God could do. And when you see God do only what God can do, you can try to live somewhere else. You can try to go back to normal, where you just plug in and plug out normal Christianity, but you can't live there. You can't stay there. That makes sense?
Yeah. There are people that don't believe that God exists. And they say that because they don't see evidence that he exists. How would you address that? How would you respond to that? Given, I guess, your experience. I'll be honest with you. What you just, and I want to go back to that question. What you just said, that's probably the longest I've ever gone without saying anything in the whole existence of this particular podcast. And I just am sitting on the edge of my seat, listening to your account, looking for something that I could question. And I just couldn't. I mean, that's an amazing account. And in my own faith walk, I have, when we talk about when you come into a relationship with God, it's not a bad deal, it's a good deal. I have heard people describe it, and I have experienced it as such, and what you just described probably multiplies that as an adventure. And the trip that you went, and the trips that you went on, especially this most recent one that you told about to Chiapas, it was no agenda. You thought you had some kind of an agenda, but you didn't. It would literally be someone would show up and take you to a place that you didn't know anything about, and you would do whatever was put before you.
That's right.
For like a week. And
Yep.
and it culminated, which is unbelievable to me. It culminated in a place on the final days, whatever it was, that was the place that you had dreamed about some months before. I mean, you had the dream before you ever saw the place. So you didn't dream about something you had already experienced. This dream was a prophetic dream. You've never been to Mexico, much less southern Mexico or Chiapas or any of those things. You don't know anything about Chiapas or Chiapas. You don't know anything about anything. And you dream a dream that manifests itself in a trip. I just don't know how to explain that.
Well, all I could do is tell people, and if the Holy Spirit is moving and working in their life, then they have to do something with it. You know, if they hear it and it becomes real what they've heard, then they can either accept or deny it. All I can do is just tell them this is what happened, and you know, and be very authentic about the fact that I'm as blown away by it as you are.
Yeah.
You know,
that's right. So what would you say to a person, and it's not to be combative, but out of love and compassion, to somebody who says, there's just no proof that God exists, and that's why I struggle with belief in God. It seems like a superstition. It seems like it's something that's sort of made up, and I don't see evidence that He is real.
But in a case like that, I always tell them, I said, if you tried to line that up the way it happened, you could never do it. It's beyond your human capability to line that up. So either God's involved in that, or I got really lucky that everything of fate and chance and luck was operating. Either these three things were operating in my life, or God, some other source other than us, was directing this. And I've just told you all that I can tell you, that I believe that there's a source that's called God that was directing this. And whether He sent me there just for those 4 kids, you know, in that college for them, or whether He sent me there for the gospel to go out to Mexico, it just shows me how much He loves us, that He would go out of His way to come and gather His own in. And I just have to leave it at that, you know, and whether the person can accept it. Certainly they would have to walk away and go, that's crazy, you know, but I don't think they can discount it, because there's too many things that happen that it didn't obvious that I didn't make it up.
It's
right?
just it's too complex of a coincidence. I mean, Hollywood writers could probably maybe come up with something and just totally fictitious, but as you're living that, I don't see how that. I challenge unbelief if the things that you just said are true.
Right.
So that is from the perspective of a non-believer. I think there is a an equally important, if not more important, message and understanding from what you just described from the believer's perspective. And here's where I'm going with that. You may be a person that's like, no, I believe in God for sure. And that is an awesome story. You don't have that experience if you're holding on to your life. If you are trying to be Joe rather than being a servant of God. He talks about dying to self. I listen to this, and throughout that whole thing, all I hear is a person whose sole mission in the face of potential danger and uncertainty and not knowing what's going on and not being prepared and all the things that you are as a person, just committed to being obedient. You believed in God so much because He's already moved in your life. You've got your own evidence. It's not like you're just going along with something that you don't truly believe in. You have your own evidence of His existence, and these things start happening which seem to be building your faith. You look around and say, that's God. It has to be. And from that point on, all the way through this thing, you are just obedient. And when He says go, or when somebody shows up to get you, there is some peace over you that says, I'm just supposed to go. And because of that, you have experienced an unbelievable adventure to start with. But I'm willing to bet what's gone on inside of you from that has been so internally and spiritually fulfilling that the world can't even touch that, right? The things of the world can't touch, and I don't want to put words in your mouth. What has gone on inside of you from what it was like being obedient to God. And he didn't call you to go weed eat at the community center,
right?
Right? Something that's easy to do, that's convenient, that's not going to mess up your schedule too much. You're going to have a couple hours Saturday where you can do that. I mean, he took you to Mexico for a week, and you didn't know anything about it. Turns out it's a pretty dangerous place in Mexico. So I guess what I'm trying to highlight is the joy and fulfillment and just unbelievable adventure that comes from obedience to God.
Yeah. Can I drive this in a different direction to the end today? Because I think there's people here that need to hear this.
Yeah.
Because it's been on my heart when I came over here. Those things continue to happen in my life for a number of years. And somewhere along the way, the church grew. Somewhere along the way, we started getting tired as a body. I'd hear things like, I'm going to step down because I'm tired. I was tired. And I kept, in a sense, I knew something's wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. And the things that we saw God do started to stop. We became very strong theologically. We could defend any point of theology that we believed. We immersed ourselves, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. But it was like the life got sucked out of the church. It was like everything all of a sudden became mechanical. And I don't think that as many people probably realize it as I did, but I was the one that God used to start the church. And I knew something was wrong, and I kept having the scripture in Revelation chapter 2 concerning the church at Ephesus. It kept coming up. It just started coming up. My buddy's like, why do you keep bringing that up? I thought, it's being brought up to me. I don't know. Something's wrong here. And people, people in the church sometimes don't know how to describe what the feeling is in the church when it changes. They'll say stuff like this: there's just a funk in the church. That makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
There's like the excitement's gone. Baptisms are gone. People stepping out of their comfort zones is gone. and we're just operating. And, it says to Ephesus, he says, I know your works. We kept working. We were still trying to do everything that we did before, but it was wearing us out now, to the point of people stepping aside and saying, I can't do this anymore. It says, I know your toil, your patience, your endurance, how you cannot bear those that are evil. You've tested those. I mean, we could spot false teaching. We could do all that stuff. It was what we did in the beginning. But he says, this is the part that kept coming up to me. He says, but I have this against you, that you've abandoned the love you had at first. I eventually stepped down as the pastor of the church. And a friend of mine stepped in that was there, was a pastor of a church that had been coming. He kind of took over, but the church never really got back to where it ever once was. And as a body, we knew enough to know that we didn't want to operate there anymore. We wanted to operate where we were. And so we agreed as a church body that we had another church up the road that was of like mind, like faith, 5 minutes down the road. Let's pray and see if God wants to just shut the door, that this ministry here is over, and our people can go to this church. And we met with that church about the fact that we would like to come and join with you. We're not coming to merge. We're coming under your authority. We'll sell everything, we had no debt. We'll sell all of our assets that we have. We'll give it to a poor church out in Texas. We'll take some of the money we got remaining. We've identified 3 young men that will help with their education and ministry. We'll donate our sound equipment to FCA, and we'll just come under your authority. We had 100% vote to do that. And it was a sad day when we closed the doors. People think we closed because there's something wrong. We closed because we knew that it wasn't operating like it was supposed to anymore. We just couldn't know. I thought I kind of knew why. And boy, that started me on a journey of the backside of the desert. I didn't realize how burnt out I was. And this is a message to anybody that's listening to me in ministry, is that sometimes you go so hard, so long, you don't even know where you're really at spiritually. Sometimes you don't realize how tired you are. And that tiredness came because I was doing these things and running in the strength of the Lord back here. And now that relationship has started to wane, and I'm still doing the work, but now I'm doing it on my own. Mm-hmm. And that'll kill you, by the way. And when I stepped down, I just had a complete mental, spiritual, physical collapse. I went to church every Sunday. All I could do to sit in the service. I'd go home at night. I tried to read my Bible, but eventually I just tried to pray. I couldn't pray. Still went to church. And that went on for 2 years, 2 solid years of my life. And I was miserable. And I want to tell you listeners that the most miserable human being in the world is not somebody that knows Christ. It's somebody that's known Christ and walked with Christ and seen Christ do what only he can do. And now your relationship has been not severed, but there's a wall there now. That's the most miserable human being on the planet. And that was me. And I thought, and my daughter, bless her heart, she's grown now. This is the girl. And my son, they're both saved, and they're doing the work of the kingdom. They found good churches, and they're active in them. And bless her heart, she'd call me up on the phone. She'd say, Dad, you got to get back in the fight, Dad. You can't stay on the sideline, Dad. You're too valuable to the kingdom. You got to get back in the fight. And I mean, from a broken heart, I say, I'm trying. I don't know how. I don't like where I'm at. But I don't know what to do. It's not in me. And so one night, I went to our other bedroom, and I was sleeping in there, and I said, I've had enough of this. And I just said, Lord, we got to talk. I said, and I just poured my heart out to him. I said, I can't stand who I am. I can't stand not having that relationship like I had with you. I understand now why you told me to read that. It's not about the work. It's about me and you. I understand now that you want me to go back when I didn't know anything about theology, and all I knew that was that you loved me and I loved you. And that's all I knew. And that was enough. I said, but I don't know how to get back there. He's like, go back and do the works again. Go back. And I said, I'm sorry for these 2 years. Maybe I needed to be here for 2 years. I said, but I'm just telling you, if I've wasted it, I'm sorry that I wasted it. If you want to use me again, use me again. If you want me to preach again, I'll preach again. If you want me to pastor again, I'll pastor again. And if you don't want to do any of those, I don't blame you. That's just the way it came out. That was on Friday night. And I laid it out there. Saturday morning at about 9 o'clock, my phone rang. And this gentleman said, hey, is this Joe Pritchard? I said, yeah. You still preaching? I probably hadn't preached in 2 years, a year and a half. I said, yeah. He said, man, we need somebody to fill in down at church. You think you can come in 2 Sundays and preach? Yes, sir. What did I preach? Revelation chapter 2. Church at Ephesus. And I wanted to try to tell people that, listen, you can have church on the wrong side of the river and God will let you do it. But if you've ever experienced God the way I've experienced him, you can't have church on the wrong side of the river and like it. Can't do it. And then all of a sudden, the things that God used to do in my life back here started coming back. I actually cared about people again. All missions work starts because you care. That's the only way they start. You witness to people because you care. You disciple people because you care. That's how it all starts. The word of the Lord came to Nehemiah. The gates of the city are burned down. The walls are torn down. And it pierced Nehemiah's heart. And he did something. He didn't just pray about it. He did something because he was overwhelmed by care. And I needed to get back. I used to care, and I went through a 2-year period where I didn't like dealing. I was glad I didn't have to deal with a kid calling me that's about to commit suicide in the bathroom of the high school, or a lady sitting down crying because the husband's about to leave, and her and the kids, and they don't know what they're going to do. And I'd gotten away from all that, and I liked it, or at least I thought I did. But that wasn't true. I just lost my compassion, and it started to come back. I'll finish with this story right here, and then you can ask me whatever question you want to ask me. When I started getting the old relationship back, it was like, all right, let's go now. I said, all right. So I had this, I teach power line design, and I was teaching them in New York for a company up in New York. And I would fly up there, and I met a guy through work who's in his 70s, and I just fell in love with him, man. He's like I don't even know what to call him. He's like I wouldn't say a dad figure, but we're just great friends. And my concern for him is that he knows the Lord. All right, and he's gave me the opportunity to talk to him about it. So every time I would go train in New York, I would intentionally fly to Syracuse so that I'd have to pick him up and drive 2.5 hours to another location instead of flying to those locations, in hopes that God would give us that opportunity to talk about him. So on one of these trips, not that long ago, get on a plane, fly to Syracuse, get in the car with him. Really no conversation like that, but we had a great time. Go to the power company. We get up next morning, pull in the gate. Guy says, we said, hey, we're here to do the distribution line design training for a group here. Well, you got to have a name to get in the facility. We're scrambling around looking for something. We pick up this folder, and on the front of the folder, there's a name on it, Mandy Bigda. I said, we're here to see Mandy Bigda. He says, oh, I love Mandy. He perked up. She's so sweet. Here's her phone number. We didn't know he gave us her personal number. He gave us the wrong number. He gave us her personal number. So we call Mandy, and we say, hey, Mandy, we're here to teach your classes today. She said, well, that's great. I'll come down and meet you. She said, how'd you get my personal number? I said, the guy at the gate's giving it out to everybody coming through the gate today. She starts laughing. I'll never forget it. Stacy, I'll never forget it. this smiling young girl comes down about my daughter's age, and she opens the door. She says, "Hi, I'm Mandy." I said, "I'm Joe Pritchard. Nice to meet you." My buddy introduces himself. She says, "Come on up." So we go up, and she's setting up the classes for us. We're there 4 days. And I can't go in a place like that and say, "I'm Joe Pritchard, the preacher. Here's the gospel."
Yeah.
Can't do that, right? But in between breaks, I would say, I went to Africa one time, and I wouldn't even touch a power pole there. Afraid I'd get electrocuted. "Oh, why'd you go to Africa?" Well, in the conversations, I kind of somehow got directed toward her more than probably the others. Found out she liked horses growing up. I said, "Hey, I got a buddy that raises barrel racing horses and roping horses." "Really?" And she's telling me a story about riding, and then all of a sudden she says, "But my riding had to stop because when I was this old, my mom died." And I could see her face drop. I could see her countenance go down. And my dad really was never part of my life. And so I had to move in with my grandfather, and he became my father figure, and I found him dead a couple years later. Countenance drops. And I'm thinking, man, my heart's just breaking for her, because I can see it in her face, but I don't know her, So we continued to talk, and at the end of the class, everybody leaves, and my buddy's talking to the manager on one end of way on the other end of the class, and here's Mandy Bigda standing right in front of me. And we're just talking. And something gets brought up about reading, and I told her what I told you earlier, is that she said, "I'm about ADD. I can't just sit down and read a lot." I said, I don't really either. I said, "But I can read the Bible." She said, "You know what?" She said, "I've been wanting to learn the Bible." She said, "I don't know anything about the Bible." She said, "I told myself I need to go get a Bible and read it so I can learn something about the Bible." I said, "Mandy, you ain't going to believe this." I said, "But I'm a preacher." In her eyes, tears got in her eyes. She said, "You're joking." I said, "No, Mandy, I'm not joking." She said, "Could you help me learn the Bible?" I said, "Mandy, I would love to help you learn the Bible." I said, "I'm going to say something to you you don't understand, but one day you will." I said, "I came up here for that man." I said, "But God sent me here today for you." I'm from Dallas, Georgia. He just sent me from Dallas, Georgia, all the way up here to Albany, New York for you. She said, "That's incredible." I said, "So when I get home, I got your number. They gave it to me at the gate." I said, "My wife and I was going to call you. Is that okay?" She said, "Yeah." I got home. I said, "Michelle, you ain't going to believe what happened." I said, "This sweet girl, our daughter's age, came up to me, and she wants to learn the Bible." And I said, "We need to reach out to her, and I need to introduce you to her." So I did. That was last year. And I introduced Michelle to her, and wouldn't you know it, guess how old my wife is? The same age that her mom is, who's now passed away.
Mm.
And they were like peanut butter and jelly immediately on the phone and on text and calls. And Michelle's loving on her, and she's just loving the fact that she has this mother. She started calling her Georgia mama. I said, "Hey, Mandy, you want to sit in on some Bible studies I'm doing online?" "Yeah." I said, "Mandy, here's what I want you to do. I want you to read the book of John." And this broke my heart, Stacy, I'll be honest with you. She said, "Where do I go buy the book of John at?"
Yeah.
And if she'd been my daughter, I said, "No, baby. It ain't a book you buy in the store." I said, "I got you a Bible on the way. It hadn't got to you yet. My wife and I bought it for you. When you get it, there's going to be a tab in it that says John. You start right there." She said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I sound so ignorant." I said, "No, you're not ignorant. You're right where you're supposed to be." So she starts coming to Bible studies, and we keep having these conversations. And we come around to this year, and I've got to go back to Albany now and teach that class again. My wife said, "I'm going to be on that plane."
Yeah.
So we buy 2 tickets. We fly to Albany. And never flew in that little bitty airport. We're coming down the escalator, and we're both looking at the baggage claim, trying to figure out where to go. And we hear this little voice of a 3-year-old, her little 3-year-old, screams out. We don't know that they're at the airport. They've come to the airport to meet us, her and her husband and her 3-year-old. And this little 3-year-old's running with her arms open toward my wife, going, "Grandma, Grandma." Jumps up and bear hugs my wife, and she says, "Can I call you Grandma?" My wife said, "You can call me anything you want to call me." And Mandy runs over and she falls on Michelle and she's going, my Georgia mama's here, my Georgia mama's here. Stacy, man, I was just blown away. And we spent a week with them. And all we did was we'd just go to the ball games with them. We'd watch her kid play ball. We'd go eat with them. Her husband's comes to find out he's on the same journey. He's out of the military, ex-Marine. And we just treated them like they were our kids. And she kept calling my daughter, text messenger, going, is it okay if are you good with me hanging around with your mom and dad like this? And in one of the texts, she says, I didn't know what it was like to have a family until now. And Kara said, no, that's what they do. And, man, we had the best time with them. And I'm going to tell you, Stacey, when we got ready to leave that week, her husband, Stephen, had to go. He worked a night shift. He had to go in. It just left me and Michelle. Mandy was pregnant with her and Waverly, her little daughter, and her 14-year-old boy, Wyatt. And we just went over and stayed with them, the last day we were there. When we got ready to leave, my wife and Mandy embraced, and they had an ugly cry. It was like we just left one of our kids and was about to go fly 3 hours back home, like you just dropped your kid off at a college for the first time. And I can still see her leaning out the door with tears in her eyes, waving bye to us as we pulled out. And I'm crying. Michelle's crying. We're just like, it's amazing how God can take people that have never known one another in their life and just all of a sudden make them like this. And I told Mandy, and she's grown in her faith. They didn't have a church. I thought, how am I going to find a church up here? I'd be looking on the map. We shared that story I just told you on Facebook, and it lit up like a Christmas tree. I was dumbfounded at the reactions that was coming out of New York and out of Dallas, Georgia, and people that knew us about this how this all came to be. And one lady said, Mandy, I'd love for you to come to our church. This is where your mom came when you were a baby.
Wow.
And I pulled that church up, and I thought, oh, man, it's going to be crazy. I pulled it up, and it's solid. And they started going to church, and she called my house. She said, we love it. We absolutely love it. And she just had a child, and the whole time she was in the hospital having her baby, she's on the phone with my wife going, I'm really nervous. My wife's like, you can do it, man. You can do it. You're strong. You can do it. And she had a beautiful, almost 10-pound baby boy. And she's kind of mentioned in a roundabout way to my daughter is that, what if your dad would baptize us? I told her, I said, one day I'm going to write a sermon. I said, if that day ever comes and I'm the one you want to baptize you, I said, I'm going to preach the message. And I said, I already know what it is. And I said, the title of it's going to be called My Name is Mandy. And there's a passage in Isaiah, I think chapter 42, and the first part of it's eluding me. It says, I know thee by name, and thou art mine. You're mine. And that's what I'm going to preach. And I'm going to say, Mandy, God moved heaven and earth to get the gospel to you because you belong to him. And that's the Savior that we serve. Stacy, that's the God we serve. That's the God that I'm just blown away with. That's why you do this broadcast. That's why people hear it and it changes their lives. There's a bigger purpose in all this than what you and I could ever dream or ever imagine. The Bible says the Lord looks out throughout the whole earth seeking those. He says the eyes of the Lord in 2 Chronicles 16:9 run to and fro throughout the earth looking for those that he can show himself strong for. He's looking for those that are fully committed to him and saying, God, I'm right here. Do with me what you want to do. And you know what he'll do? He'll do it. End of story.
I just, as an observer, observe God pulling you into his purposes and filling your heart with compassion and obedience. And when we do that, we get into the work that he calls us into. And I think there are times where in that work, it becomes about the work, and the first love is set over here to do the work that was rooted in love in the first place. And it sounds like you went through that season too. And then he said, no, let's just reconnect to me. It's John 15. It's the vine and the branches. And
it's a genuine love.
It is. And it's our job is to stay connected to the vine. It's to stay connected to the love that is him. He is God is love. He says, abide in me. That's the one thing he asks us to do as he lays that out. It's like you don't have to produce fruit. You will produce fruit, but only when you abide in me, when the mission is about the love of God, not the work. And I see that in churches. I see that in pastors. I see that in people in ministry and of faith that get exhausted because they are so immersed in the work that sometimes they aren't immersed in the Father.
You know, it's funny that God used my little girl to lead me to Christ. And then when we got to New York, this little 3-year-old girl who talks very grown up, by the way, gets in my lap for the first time, hugs my neck at a dinner table, and she looks me right in the eye and she says, Grandpa, she said, can I call you Grandpa? I said, you sure can. She said, I love you. And it just took me all the way back. Come to me as a little child. You know, you'll come to me as a little child or you won't come at all. And she reminded me of what it was like when it was just, the love was that genuine, not knowing anything really else. She just decided she loved me, and she's going to tell me. And so, you know, that kind of thing, seeing that come back in our lives again has encouraged us. And by the way, when you begin to set your heart and mind like a flint towards the kingdom, you're going to run into every adversary he's got.
Yep.
You know, you just keep that in mind, but it's worth it in the end. You know, it's worth it for the Mandys and the other people that might be affected by that. But what a great ministry you got right here that's helping people. You don't even know that's just helping.
We're counting on that.
Yeah, it's
we
been
pray
a blessing
for that.
For me.
Joe, I don't need to have any commentary. What I would say to the things that you've said, he who has ears, let him hear. Because God spoke through so many truths about his nature and his goodness and his love for us and what life with him is, that nothing else needs to be said. Joe Pritchard, what a blessing it has been to hear you give an account of the presence and movement of God in your life through the amazing and through the hard and through the dark and dry and through the light and joy. And what a powerful time. Thank you.
Everything's about him. Everything he does is for his glory, and everything we do is for his glory at the end of the day. And if we get to be a part of that, it's an amazing life that we get to live.
Thank God for Joe Pritchard.
Thank you.
Joe called me the other day and said, Stacy, I have some great news. Mandy and her family are driving from New York to Georgia so that I can baptize her. Praise God. For more conversations like this one, please visit astrongerfaith.org or subscribe to our channel on YouTube or Apple Podcasts. To recommend a guest for us, please visit astrongerfaith.org/contact or email us at contact@astrongerfaith.org. To support this work and the growth of this ministry, please visit astrongerfaith.org/give. Until next time, we pray for peace and a stronger faith for you and those you love.